over, Johnny. It's over.
Nothing is over! Nothing! You just don't turn it off!
You all know what you have to do. Remember, no one, and I mean no one, comes into our house and pushes us around.
Nothing's difficult.
Everything's a challenge.
Through adversity to the stars.
From the last plane to the last bullet to the last minute to the last man, we fight.
We fight.
We fight.
We fight.
We fight.
We fight.
Welcome in, everyone, to Extreme Talk. My name is James Shannon. Thank you so much for checking out this edition of Extreme Talk and for really coming to our YouTube channel. And I hope while you're here, you go check out some of our other videos, the Extreme Radio episodes from every Sunday where they air live at 4 p.m. You can go re-listen to those. You can also check out our highlight film that our guy Isaiah Austin does a fantastic job putting together. And at the end of the season, a lot of people have asked about this, we'll be releasing our games, one game per week. I think we did 20 or 21 games. But we'll be releasing them one per week, and that way you can relive and watch back on some of the games from this year. We've done some incredible ball games. And there's some games that I wish we could have done, but we've done some incredible ball games, and so we're excited to be able to share those with y'all after the season is over, because it'll probably be the first of the year when we start doing that. We'll kind of take the month of December off and part of November, just kind of spend time with family and put football on the back burner, because we go hard from July to November, and then even during the off season we're still doing stuff. But every once in a while when you can take a break, not think about football, not deal with the business side or the radio media side. Anytime you just step away from it and spend more time with family, I've come to find out that that's better. So we'll probably start doing that first of the year. But we don't want to release the videos during the season, or at least the broadcast, make them public, because we don't want to give out free film to different teams and coaches. If you're a coach and we broadcast your game, that's pretty much like giving film to a guy that, instead of you giving to give it to him or knowing that he has it, all of a sudden he has it and you have no idea, and you guys got to have to play coming up. It's just bad strategy. And so, we try not to do that. We're here for the coaches. We're here to help. But at the same time, we're not in helping a coach. We're not going to infringe on another coach. So that's the plan with that. But anyways, that's the long way to say, go check out some of the stuff on our YouTube channel. This week, I'm going to break down the most likely scenarios for the playoffs. This is not every single scenario, because trust me, I've spent 2 to 3 hours with a whiteboard and a marker going through every scenario where, let's take the MTAC North, for instance. There are 3, 4, 5 games still left to go, and there's a crazy number of combinations that could happen, but most of those combinations narrow down to 5 scenarios, and so that's the 5 scenarios I'm going to talk about right now. And of course, this is barring any absolute insane ones like South Haven Christian upsetting Christian Community and Lighthouse. I mean, that would be insane at this point, and so we're gonna save a little bit of time. We're not gonna roll through those, but I do want to take a look at the 5 most likely scenarios that will happen. I'm not gonna say the most likely of them, because these could go either way. So there's not really a most likely for this, but I will start with the most unique situation that could happen, and that would be if Christian Community beat Lighthouse Christian and South Haven Christian, Sacred Heart beat Bowling Green Christian, Lighthouse Christian also beat Bowling Green Christian and South Haven Christian, but loses to Christian Community School. And then if the Heat, of course, the Heat are done with their MTAC games, so they're kind of, I don't want to say their destiny's not in their hands. I mean, they 3-2, it's pretty solid. So they have to hope for some miracles to happen to get into the playoffs. Now they're highly likely to get into the MTAC Bowl. Matter of fact, 4 out of 5 scenarios I have, they're in the MTAC Bowl, and really. Two of these scenarios are the exact same. Actually, I'll take that back. There are 3 scenarios that the Heat make it into the MTAC Bowl, possibly 4, depending on some situations. And then 2 of them, for sure, where they make it into the bowl game. Or 3 of them. 3 of them for sure where they make it into the bowl game. A 4th is a possibility. And there's another situation where they could even make it into the playoffs. And that's pretty crazy. But we'll break this down. And the reason that the Heat cannot be out of the postseason is because they beat Bowling Green Christian and Sacred Heart, and both of those teams have 2 losses. So even if they go 3-2, the Heat still hold the tiebreaker over them, sitting at 3-2. So the Heat will not be knocked out of the postseason. They will have to play in the bowl game more than likely. I'd say about 4 out of 5 times. And again, there's a situation where, and I'll talk about it in a second, but where they could not make the playoffs. The most unique situation is if Christian Community beats Lighthouse Christian and South Haven Christian, if Sacred Heart beats Bowling Green Christian, if Lighthouse also beats Bowling Green Christian and South Haven Christian, but they lose to Christian Community, and like I said, the Heat have played all the North games, then Christian Community would sit at 5-0, and South Haven Christian, Sacred Heart, Lighthouse Christian, and the Heat would all sit at 3-2. And of course, we have a nice situation because Sacred Heart beat Lighthouse, Lighthouse beat the Heat, and then the Heat beat Sacred Heart. So my understanding of the tiebreaker is that, of course, this year, the league made it to where you had to play all the teams in your division, so 5 games, and then 2 from the other division. I think I've said 3 in the past. It's 2 teams from the other division. My understanding is your 2 games from the other division, you have a designated rival team, a team that you will play every year. So for Lancaster Christian, for instance, it is the Tennessee Heat. They will play the Tennessee Heat every year. And I'm really looking forward to that because if you look at how their game went early in the season, it was a good ball game. So you have a rival game, that's your first tiebreaker, and then you have a rotating game, and so you'll kind of cycle through opponents in the other division. But so for instance, for the Webb School, it's the Heat. That's their rotating game this year, which of course that game's coming up on Saturday, and that's a pretty big matchup in terms of playoff scenarios and seeding and situations. So that's the tie-breaking scenario. There would be a 3-way tie here, and at this point, I'm not privy to who the rival team is, quote unquote, for Sacred Heart and Lighthouse. For Lighthouse, it could be Franklin Christian, maybe, which in that case they beat them. They also beat St. Andrew Swanee this past Friday night, and they lost to Lancaster. For Sacred Heart, they more than likely will pick up the win tomorrow night against Classical. They picked up the win against Riverside Christian, and then they play Lancaster Christian near the end of the year. Now, depending on how Lancaster finishes out the year, this could be a win or a loss. I'm thinking a loss. I've got predicted for a loss. So that would happen there. But again, I don't know the rival teams at this time. So, that's a challenge for the conference. Hey, let's make some more of this information public. Let's get more of this information out here. There's way too much. The coaches know who it is, but there needs to be stuff like this made known to the public. I'm just saying there needs to be this. And here's the thing. My problem with playing two teams for the other division, and especially with the rotating, is you never know who's going to be good and bad. But if you have your rival team, and let's say you're Franklin Classical, and your rival team is Christian Community, there's only been 1 year Christian Community hasn't made the playoffs. So they're always a really good team year in and year out. And that is not me being a homer. It's kind of obvious that you're at least a decent team if you make the playoffs all but 1 year for 10 years. Just saying. So if you're Franklin Classical, you get Christian Community, you're kind of messed over. I mean, unless you have a really good team and you catch them on a down year. The easy solution to this? Put the tiebreaker back on the dadgum field. Not in the hands of the conference, not in the hands of the scheduling. Put it on the field. Points against. You say, James, that changes the way coaches coach. Malarkey. I'll prove it to you. I proved it to you but last year with the three-way tie. This year with a potential three-way tie. Sacred Heart beat Lighthouse by 10 points. Lighthouse beat Heat by 4 points. Heat beat Sacred Heart by 2 points. So there you go. I mean, there's not a whole lot of blowouts happening in that scenario. There's just not. At Sacred Heart, there's just not. At Sacred Heart, allowed 58 points. The Heat allowed 46 points, and Lighthouse allowed 60. So if the correct tie-breaking scenario was in place, the Heat, who allowed fewer points, would win that tiebreaker. Sacred Heart would be in second with 58 points. Lighthouse would be with 60. And you say, okay, well, again, this whole thing is leave the tiebreaker on the field. And people claim it changes the way coaches coach. No, sir. Because if you have an offense struggling against you, why are you going to pull your starters out on defense and then take the chance on allowing the other team to come back on you? Great example. Earlier in the year, Bowling Green Christian, Tennessee Heat. It really is the perfect example of this situation. Of course, it was a Heat win, and the Heat had a big lead in the first half. Third quarter, decided to pull some starters. Bowling Green came roaring back, made it a ball game. The Heat were blowing out Bowling Green in the first half. So, if you leave your defensive starters in, I'm all for taking your offensive starters out. That's fine. That's how it should be. If you're up by mercy rule, or you're up, let's say 4 touchdowns, without 2-point conversions, that's 24 points. So if you're up by 24 points and you decide to pull your offensive starters, and you leave your defensive starters in, or let's say you put your defensive backups in, all of a sudden, here's 2 touchdowns. Here's 3 touchdowns. All of a sudden, you got to send your starters back out there who are cold because they haven't been playing on offense or defense. So that's just an insane way of thinking on a solution that really should be in place. I mean, I'm big on those two things. It needs to be points allowed as a 3-way tiebreaker, and there needs to be a 16 playoff. Those are the two things I'm dogmatic on. And one day they'll happen, and then there'll be some legitimacy. But anyways, So that's the most unique situation. Another situation is that, and people say, well, this is the most likely. It could be the most likely. But here it is. If Christian Community beats Lighthouse Christian and Sacred Heart, or I'm sorry, and South Haven, and if Lighthouse Christian beats Bowling Green and South Haven, but loses to Christian Community, and of course you have the Heat sitting at 3-2, then Christian Community at 5-0 would have the 1 seed. Lighthouse Christian at 3-2 would hold the 2 seed because they hold a tiebreaker over the Heat, who would also be 3-2. So the Heat would head to the MTAC Bowl. This is probably the most likely scenario. And again, if you take this scenario and flip it with the one I mentioned just a second ago, what you get is your 3-way tie. So there's 2 of them. Another scenario is Lighthouse Christian ending up at 4-1. If they win out the season, they're going to go 4-1. They sit at 1-1 right now. That would put Christian Community at 4-1, given that they beat South Haven. Again, they could lose to South Haven, and this would throw a monkey wrench in all of this. But we're going to go with scenarios and games playing out the way that they will over, I would say, about 75 to 90%. Probably 75, because some, Bowling Green and Sacred Heart's kind of back and forth. I would give it about 75-25. We'll go with 75%. So CCS, like I said, would be 4-1. Lighthouse would be 4-1. Hold the tiebreaker with the win over CCS. And then you would have the Heat sitting at 3-2 again, so they would make the MTAC Bowl. Lighthouse Christian would host a playoff spot. Christian Community would travel. And we'll get to where they could potentially travel in just a second. Another situation, of course, that's the only situation where Christian Community is 4-1. And there's others, but they all line up with this scenario. Another scenario is Christian Community being at 5-0, of course, winning out. The Heat actually sitting at 3-2, having the number 2 seed. And if Bowling Green tomorrow night upsets Lighthouse, yes, I'm calling it Bowling Green upsetting Lighthouse. If Lighthouse beats Bowling Green, that's not an upset. First off, Bowling Green's never beat Lighthouse. Second off, and again, I'm going to say this, Bowling Green has had the easiest path to 4-2, to 4 wins. They beat South Haven, who has not won a game, Classical, who has not won a game, Swanee, now that was a tough game. I'll give them that one. That was a tough game. Hard-fought game. But again, you shouldn't have a close game with a team that hasn't won a game. And then you've got Bowling Green playing Franklin Christian. That was a tough game for about a half, maybe 3/4, and then they pulled away. As they should. But they should be blowing out these winless teams. But again, they've blown out 2 winless teams. I will give them that. I will give them props to that. Well, they didn't blow out Swanee. They should have blown out Swanee. It was a tough game, tight game. But I'm just the possibility. Now, granted, Bowling Green could have the motivation that if this happens, they beat Lighthouse and they beat Sacred Heart, they're going to get into the bowl game. That could happen. That could very well happen. So that could be motivation enough to get them psyched and jacked up and ready to go. So in that situation, CCS 5-0, Heat 3-2, Bowling Green 3-2. Of course, Sacred Heart and Lighthouse 2-3, and South Haven Christian 0-5. The final scenario, I'd give it about 75% of these games going this way. The final scenario, or scenario if you prefer, it's actually identical to the first scenario. It's just a different way of getting there. And that is, if Christian Community beats South Haven Christian, but they lose to Lighthouse Christian, and if Lighthouse Christian can beat South Haven Christian and Christian Community, now a lot of this hinges on tomorrow night's game. How can Bowling Green do against Lighthouse? If Bowling Green upsets Lighthouse, Lighthouse will sit at 3-2. The Heat will sit at 3-2. And then, of course, Bowling Green Christian would sit at 2-3. Sacred Heart would sit at 2-3. And South Haven Christian at 1-4. And even if Bowling Green Christian, this is with Bowling Green Christian beating Sacred Heart. Again, Sacred Heart beats Bowling Green, and the scenario happens back to three-way tie at 3-2. So, really, those are the 5 scenarios that have the most likelihood of happening, and the one with the highest likelihood of happening, in my opinion, of course this is my opinion, is Christian Community at 1, Lighthouse Christian 2, the Heat at 3. And again, it's crazy because Lighthouse Christian, it's crazy when they started the season and the way they've done the roster, and all of a sudden now they're in a playoff. They're a playoff contender every year. So, just the way that they organize everything, it's crazy. Now, the scenario that I think would be the coolest is Christian Community at 1, Heat at 2, Bowling Green 3. Reason being, Heat haven't been in the playoffs, and you could say they were in the Division 2 playoffs, whatever, a few years ago, but have not been in the Division 1 playoffs in, my gosh, it's been a minute. It's been a solid minute. Probably 2012, I think. Maybe 2012. Yeah, I think it was. No, it had been 2011. 2012 was Christian Community and Aaron Academy. 2011 is when the Heat lost to Franklin Classical. That was the last time that the Heat were in the big playoffs, the big show. And then, of course, Bowling Green Christian would make the bowl game, first ever bowl game, and they would actually end up going 6-2, and then depending on how their game with Riverside Christian goes, they could go 7-2 overall, which would be crazy. That would be pretty insane. It would be great. I think it'd be great for a team in there. Now, granted, I did say they have had the easiest path to 4 wins, but I think they would really, really earn those wins. That would legitimize them, even just really legitimize them if they beat Lighthouse Christian and Sacred Heart and then go beat Riverside. I think so. I think that would really, really legitimize their situation and the number of wins they have. The first 4, The 7-win season, okay. You beat some teams at the end. I'll give you props for that. So those are the most likely scenarios in the MTAC North and how they could play out. Now, the MTAC South is a completely different animal. Just a crazy situation. And I actually have 7 scenarios playing out for that. And a couple of them have the same results. It's just a different way of getting there. So, and there's really only 2 results that end up the same. Because it's crazy. It's crazy how it can work out. Let's dive in. So the two most likely scenarios, in my opinion, is if Webb beats Franklin Christian and St. Andrew Sewanee, Lancaster Christian beats Franklin Classical and St. Andrew Sewanee, and this Friday night, tomorrow night, of course, we said Lighthouse Bowling Green is a massive, pivotal MTAC North game. This game is massive. It's huge. Riverside Christian, Franklin Christian. If Franklin Christian beats Riverside, of course they would both end up 3-2 in the division, and Franklin Christian would hold the tiebreaker. So that would put Webb at number 1, Lancaster at number 2, and Franklin Christian at number 3. So Franklin Christian would head to the MTAC Bowl, and their opponents, it could be the Heat. FCA Heat would be a good game, I think. FCA Bowling Green, we saw that one preseason, and that could be a good game. And then, of course, with the situation in the North where there could be a tiebreaker, we've seen FCA Lighthouse, rather. I said FCA Heat would be interesting. FCA Sacred Heart would be interesting. So there's a couple ways that could play out. And then, of course, with you could have Lancaster playing CCS for the first time. You could have Lighthouse going to Webb, which they've got some history between each other. You could have Lancaster playing Lighthouse again and CCS and Webb matching up. That's a possible situation. You could have Heat going to Webb, a rematch of the Saturday night. And then you could have Lancaster going to CCS. So it could go a bunch of different ways. But that situation, and then of course it's this exact same situation, but if Riverside beats Franklin Christian, the winner of Friday night's game, if the rest of the games play out, barring FCA beating Webb, the winner of tomorrow night will play in the MTAC Bowl. That's just the way the situation is. It's the way the cookie crumbles. And there's some other crazy upsets that could happen, and we'll break that down. So those are the two most likely scenarios. Webb 1, Lancaster 2, Franklin Christian, or Riverside Christian at number 3. Another scenario is Lancaster Christian having the number 1 seed at 4-1, and that's if Lancaster beats Franklin Classical and St. Andrew Sewanee. If Webb gets upset by Franklin Christian and upset by their rival, St. Andrew Sewanee, and if FCA can beat Riverside and, like I said, upset Webb, Franklin Christian will have the number 2 seed in the playoffs. And you say that's the craziest scenario ever. No, that's coming. That scenario's coming. Wait for it. So you could have Lancaster Christian number 1. You could have Franklin Christian Academy number 2, which, of course, let's say they squeak in the playoffs and all of a sudden they've got to travel to Lighthouse, who whooped them, or CCS, who whooped them. So it's kind of just a pride thing that, hey, we got in the playoffs, and then, if you have FCA, CCS, and they lose, and then you have Lighthouse, Lancaster, you can end up playing Lighthouse in the consolation, and then then you saw how that game happened, how that game went first part of the season. So that situation is insane as well. But that is a possibility. And then, of course, another situation is if Lancaster beats Franklin Classical and St. Andrew Sewanee, and then if Webb loses to St. Andrew Sewanee and Franklin Christian, but then Riverside beats Franklin Christian, Riverside would take the 3 seed, Webb would hold their 2 seed, and then Lancaster Christian would hold the 1 seed. And the way that works is because Franklin Christian only has 1 loss. Riverside has 2 losses. So if Franklin Christian beats both teams, Riverside and Webb, then they get the number 2 seed because they only have 1 loss. And they have lost to Lancaster. But if Riverside can can beat Franklin Christian, and if Franklin Christian can upset Webb, but can't get the job done against Riverside, which I don't understand. I mean, yeah, it's possible because you play tomorrow night, so you could beat Riverside, or you could lose to Riverside, and that'd be enough motivation for you to go to Webb and upset Webb. That could happen. I'm sure Riverside would hate to lose to FC, or is kind of rooting for that situation, because you beat FCA, and then FCA beats Webb, and you slide into the playoffs, or into the bowl game. So there's that. Now we get to some of the crazier situations. And by the way, there is a scenario where Webb is 1, Lancaster is 2, and FCA is 3. And that is if Sewanee can beat Franklin Classical, but then lose to Webb and Lancaster. That would put Sewanee at 1-4. Franklin Classical, like I said, loses to Sewanee, but then beats Lancaster. That would put FCS at 1-4. And if FCA loses to Webb and beats Riverside, that's the exact same scenario as the very first one that I mentioned. It's just a different way of getting there, because you have Sewanee upsetting Classical. So, and then, everything happening crazy. Sewanee upsetting Lancaster. But then FCA drops their, anyways. So that's how that situation could play out. Because there you would have Webb at 3-2, Lancaster at 3-2, and so on and so forth. So that's that's kind of similar to the first one. Actually, it's identical to the first one, it's just a different way of getting there. And if you're confused by now, I hope you aren't. Maybe you're just putting this in to go to sleep or kill time while you're driving. That's cool. That's cool. So another situation that could happen, and this is these next 3 are kind of insane, but likely, but not likely, but possible. So if St. Andrews Sewanee can upset Webb and Lancaster and Franklin Classical, and if Classical can upset Lancaster and FCA beats Webb and Riverside, then you would have Webb sitting at 3-2, Lancaster sitting at 2-3, Riverside sitting at 2-3, as well as Classical, and Sewanee would sit at 3-2. And guess who would be number 1? FCA. So FCA 1, Sewanee 2, Webb 3. Talk about an insane situation. It's possible, but highly unlikely. Another situation, another scenario, is if St. Andrews Sewanee beats Webb, but loses, and wins their rivalry game, but then loses to Lancaster and Franklin Classical. If Classical can beat Lancaster and Sewanee, and then if Franklin Christian can beat Webb and Riverside, then Webb would have 2 losses on the year, but they would still stay in second place. FCA would leapfrog both Webb and Lancaster, because Lancaster would have lost to Classical. So they would have 2 losses on the year. So you would have FCA at 1, Webb at 2, Lancaster at 3. Pretty insane situation. Lancaster knocked to the bowl game, Webb sent on the road. You never know, though. And the last situation is pretty crazy too, but it involves every team either being 2-3 or 3-2. If St. Andrews Sewanee can upset Webb and Lancaster, but then lose to Classical, so that would make them 2-3 on the year in the division. If Franklin Classical can beat Sewanee and Lancaster, and that would make Franklin Classical 2-3. And then if FCA beats Webb but loses to Riverside, then FCA would go to 3-2. Riverside would be at 3-2. And Classical, like I said, would be at 2-3. So you would have Webb at number 1 at 3-2. You would have a three-way tie, 3-3-2 teams, FCA, Webb, Riverside. Well, Webb holds the tiebreaker over Riverside, as well as FCA. And depending on tomorrow night results, it could be, FCA. Let's say FCA loses to Riverside. So then that would put Riverside below FCA. And so it would be Webb 1, FCA 2, Riverside 3. So those are the 7. Actually, I think I miscounted. I think there's 8 scenarios. I can't even count. 8 scenarios that could happen in the MTech South. I love it. I love this time of year. It's great. Tomorrow night's games. After tomorrow night's games, you hit October, and it's on. The race is on. Some teams taking weeks off for fall break or to take a week off. So there won't be as many games happening across the league. We're kind of getting spoiled this week and last week. The only 2 weeks of the season where every MTAC team is playing a game. But like in next week, there's only 4 games. Sewanee Classical, Webb FCA, Heat Riverside, and then Christian Community hosts the Freedom Cowboys. So there's only a few games, kind of slim pickings. Well, you go from 4 to 6, but still, from 4 to 6 is a decent sized jump. So those are the most likely scenarios for the MTAC North and the South. I mentioned some of the matchups that I think would be cool. I think if Webb and Christian Community could get matched up, of course they haven't played them forever. If the insane situation of FCA 1, Sewanee 2, Webb 3 happened, and Christian Community gets the 1 seed, you could have the first Sewanee Christian Community game since 2012, which is long overdue. Now, the one thing I will give this rotating way that they're doing things is it will give teams a chance to play other teams in the other division. So Lancaster would kind of get around the North and play some teams that they haven't not played. If they don't get to play Christian Community in the playoffs this year, they could play Christian Community at some point. Unless they play them in the championship, But anyways, it'd be crazy. But again, the most likely situation in my opinion, is Webb with the 1 seed, Lancaster with the 2 seed, and I've got Riverside picked to beat Franklin Christian. And I feel good about that pick. So, given that, and then the most likely scenario for the North, you would have Webb hosting Lighthouse, Webb hosting Lighthouse, which again, you've got some history. You would have FCA and the Heat, which, it's been a while since those teams played. And I think they might have played the last couple years. Matter of fact, I'm pretty sure they played last year. They were MTech South opponents. They played every year. They played last year. FCA won big. And then, of course, you would have Lancaster Christian Community. And, of course, I've got to be careful this year about saying, well, we saw the championship game in the semis because we saw what happened last year. That came back to bite me in the rear end. But anyways, I would love to see I'm looking forward to see what kind of matchups happen, what kind of scenarios play out. I'm excited. I'm probably going to go to the Bowling Green Lighthouse game tomorrow night. Well, I'm going to take my wife, but you know what I mean. Going to go up there, check that game out. Make sure you check out Spencer and the guys if you get a chance. They'll be in Jackson. They're driving down to Jackson tomorrow. Tomorrow evening, afternoon, late afternoon. They'll have Franklin Classical and Sacred Heart. So game might get out of hand, but go check them out. They're doing a great job. I'm very proud of them. I'm very thankful for them. So that's all I got. That's how everything could play out. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for checking out this episode. Make sure you go follow us on social media. We got 500 followers on Instagram. That's insane. So go give us a follow on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. When we have our Player of the Week vote polls, make sure you vote. Get out and vote. It doesn't take 2 seconds to scroll through our story, look at the stats, go back to the first part of the story where the poll is and vote real quick. It doesn't take anything. You don't even have to go to the same school that the guys are nominated from. Just, if you've played them, you know how good they are. Or you can appreciate how good of a game they had. That's something that bugs me too. I'm not going to get into it. I'm trying to wrap it up. But come on. You don't have to go to the same school with a guy to vote for him. That's all I'm going to say. But again, thank you for listening. Thank you for checking this out. I know it was very confusing, but hopefully maybe you were able to get a pen and the paper, or you can go back and listen to this and write down the scenarios, and you can follow through with them. We'll keep you updated on Extreme Radio, which airs every Sunday at 4 p.m. live on our YouTube channel. Spencer, Isaiah, I jump in on the end for Skip the Sensitivity and the predictions. It's going to be a great, fantastic, fun end to the season. Hope you guys go catch a game tomorrow night. There's games all over the place. See ya!